Welcome to Midnight Chronicles tonight. I'll tell you a true story from America's stranger side, one that's a little forgotten, a little unbelievable, and just quiet enough to help you drift away. Picture this. It's 1804 and you're standing on the banks of the Hudson River at dawn. The mist clings to the water like secrets, and somewhere across that grey expanse, two of America's most powerful men are about to settle their differences with pistols. One will die, the other will become so reviled that he'll eventually try to carve out his own kingdom in the American wilderness. You probably couldn't survive 5 minutes in their world of honor duels and political backstabbing, but that's what makes it perfect for drifting off to sleep. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing this story is floating across different time zones as people settle in for the night, so settle in, dim the lights, and let the past whisper you to sleep. You're watching the morning of July 11th, 1804, unfold in slow motion. The location is Weehawken, New Jersey, a name that sounds like a sneeze but hosts one of America's most consequential moments. Aaron Burr, the sitting vice president of the United States, faces Alexander Hamilton, former Secretary of the Treasury and architect of America's financial system. They're here because of words, bitter, cutting words that have been building between them for years, like pressure in a steam engine. You can smell the river mud and hear the gentle lapping of water against the rocky shore. The morning air carries that particular dampness that makes your clothes stick to your skin. The kind of humidity that would have you reaching for air conditioning if you lived in their time. But these men stand rigid in their formal coats, following an elaborate code of honor that seems almost theatrical to modern eyes. Hamilton's seconds, his friends who arranged this whole affair, have chosen the weapons, a matched pair of dueling pistols that belonged to Hamilton's brother-in-law. The irony isn't lost on anyone present that these same pistols were used in the duel that killed Hamilton's eldest son just 3 years earlier. It's like using your grandfather's cursed sword to settle a family dispute, except the curse is very real and very deadly. You watch as the two men take their positions, backs to each other, then pace off the traditional 10 steps. Their footsteps crunch on the coarse gravel, each step measured and deliberate. Burr moves with the confidence of someone who has already made peace with what's about to happen. Hamilton seems more hesitant, his shoulders carrying the weight of a man who knows he's about to leave behind a wife and 7 children. The command comes present. Both men turn and raise their pistols. What happens next will be debated by historians for centuries, but here's what you see. Hamilton's shot goes wide, his bullet striking a tree branch 12 feet above Burr's head. Some say he deliberately missed, firing into the air to preserve his honor without taking a life. Others argue his shot was simply poor, the result of nerves or the early morning light playing tricks on his aim. Burr's response is swift and decisive. His bullet finds its target, striking Hamilton just above the right hip and lodging in his spine. You watch as the man who essentially created America's banking system crumples to the ground, his political career and his life bleeding out onto the New Jersey soil. The aftermath unfolds with the surreal quality of a fever dream. Hamilton's friends rush to his side, but there's little they can do. Medical knowledge in 1804 extends roughly to apply pressure and pray, which works about as well as you'd expect for a spinal injury. Hamilton lingers for 36 hours before dying, enough time for the news to spread through New York like wildfire, and Burr. He stands there for a moment looking down at what he's done before his own seconds hustle him away. You can almost see the exact moment when he realizes his political future has just died, along with Hamilton. In a single morning, Aaron Burr has transformed from the Vice President of the United States to a man so toxic that even his own political party will abandon him. The duel itself was legal. Technically, New Jersey had more relaxed laws about such things than New York, which is why they rode across the river for their morning appointment with destiny. But legality and social acceptability are two very different things, especially when you've just killed the most popular politician in America, not named George Washington. You follow Burr as he flees the scene, his carriage clattering over cobblestones, as he makes his way back to Manhattan. The city he returns to is already changing around him, whispers following in his wake like smoke from a fire. By evening, Hamilton's supporters are calling for Burr's arrest, and newspapers are painting him as a cold-blooded murderer who shot down a defenseless man. But here's the thing. Historians still debate. Was this really about honor and insults? Or was it about something much larger? Hamilton had been systematically destroying Burr's political career for years, blocking his appointments and spreading rumors about his character. Some scholars argue that Burr saw the duel as his only chance to silence his most effective enemy. Others maintain it was simply the tragic result of two proud men who refused to back down. What's certain is that Aaron Burr, at age 48, has just committed political suicide. The man who once tied Thomas Jefferson for the presidency, who served as vice president and commanded respect in the highest circles of American society, will never hold office again. His friends abandon him, his political allies distance themselves, and even his own daughter begins to worry about the family name. But this is just the beginning of Aaron Burr's story. Because when a man loses everything, his reputation, his career, his place in society, he sometimes decides that if he can't rule the America that rejected him, he'll create a new America that will welcome him as king. And that's exactly what Aaron Burr is about to try to do. The seeds of conspiracy are already being planted in his mind as he sits in his Manhattan home, reading newspaper after newspaper that paints him as a villain. Somewhere in those dark hours, after Hamilton's death, a dangerous idea begins to take shape. If the United States won't have him, perhaps it's time to create a new nation that will. You're watching Aaron Burr's world collapse in slow motion, like a controlled demolition, where every support beam has been carefully calculated to fall at precisely the right moment. The man who once dined with presidents now finds himself dining, alone, his social calendar as empty as a ghost town saloon. It's the kind of social death that would have you stress eating ice cream and binge watching Netflix, except Ben & Jerry's won't be invented for another 174 years, and the closest thing to entertainment is watching paint dry, literally. The transformation is swift and brutal. Within weeks of Hamilton's death, Burr discovers what it means to be truly radioactive in early American society. You follow him as he walks through the streets of New York, watching how conversations stop mid-sentence when he approaches. Former friends cross the street to avoid him, their sudden interest in storefront windows almost comically obvious. It's like being the protagonist in a zombie movie, except instead of craving brains, everyone just wants to avoid catching whatever's social disease they think he's carrying. His political career, once so promising, evaporates like morning dew in the desert sun. The Republican Party, not the modern version, but Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, essentially excommunicates him. You can almost hear the doors slamming shut across Washington as former allies decide that Aaron Burr is no longer someone they can afford to know. The man who came within a whisker of becoming president in 1800 is now too toxic to be elected dog catcher in the smallest frontier town. The financial consequences hit just as hard. Burr's law practice, once thriving, begins hemorrhaging clients faster than a punctured water balloon. Who wants to hire the lawyer who solved his last major dispute with a pistol? His debts, always substantial due to his expensive tastes and grand lifestyle, begin mounting like snow in a blizzard. You watch him selling off possessions, liquidating investments, doing everything short of holding a garage sale to keep his head above water. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where historians still scratch their heads in bewilderment. Instead of quietly retiring to the countryside to write his memoirs and tend a garden, Burr does something that seems almost incomprehensible. He decides to double down on ambition. It's like losing your job and immediately applying to become CEO of a Fortune 500 company, except his version involves potentially committing treason against the United States. You're present for the quiet conversations that begin taking place in shadowy corners of New York taverns. Burr starts reaching out to a very specific type of person, men with grievances against the federal government, adventurers looking for quick fortunes, and anyone who might be interested in grand schemes involving the American West. These aren't exactly the kind of people you'd invite to a dinner party, unless your dinner party involved plotting to overthrow governments. The Western Territories in 1804 represent something like the Wild West of political possibility. You have to remember that the Louisiana Purchase has just doubled the size of the United States, adding vast territories that most Americans couldn't find on a map if their lives depended on it. The federal government's control over these regions is tenuous at best, like trying to manage a house party from 3 states away. Local officials often operate with near-complete autonomy, and the line between legitimate governance and organized crime is sometimes refreshingly blurry. Burr begins to see opportunity in this chaos. You watch him studying maps by candlelight, his finger tracing the course of the Mississippi River and the theoretical boundaries of territories that exist more in legal documents than in practical reality. He's beginning to formulate a plan that would make modern corporate raiders look like amateur hour, except instead of hostile takeovers, he's thinking about hostile countries. The social isolation that would drive most people to despair seems to energize Burr in unexpected ways. You observe him during this period, noting how he carries himself with the same confidence he displayed before the duel, as if being cast out of polite society has freed him from the constraints that once limited his thinking. It's the kind of dangerous liberation that comes when you realize you have nothing left to lose, except possibly your life. His correspondence during this period, much of which survives today, reveals a man who's not just planning a comeback, he's planning a complete reinvention. Letters to associates hint at grand schemes involving territories, governments, and the kind of wealth that comes from being in charge of your own country. He writes with the enthusiasm of someone planning a vacation, except his vacation involves potentially starting a war. The most fascinating aspect of Burr's psychology during this period is how he seems to view his situation not as a defeat, but as an opportunity for upgrade. You can almost see him thinking, if I can't be Vice President of the United States, perhaps I can be President of my own United States. It's the kind of thinking that would get you committed to a mental institution today, but in 1804, it was the kind of thinking that might just be crazy enough to work. What's particularly remarkable is how Burr manages to maintain his personal charm even while plotting what amounts to the dismemberment of his own country. You watch him at social gatherings, the few he's still invited to, and he's still the same witty, sophisticated conversationalist he always was. He just happens to be planning treason on the side, the way other people might plan a weekend getaway to the mountains. The winter of 1804 to 1805 marks the end of Aaron Burr's old life and the beginning of something unprecedented in American history. You're witnessing the birth of a conspiracy that will eventually involve Spanish officials, American generals, and enough money to fund a small war. Because that's exactly what Aaron Burr is planning to do. Start his own country, with himself, as its founding father and first king. Remember that dueling pistol that ended Hamilton's life? It's about to become the least dangerous weapon in Aaron Burr's arsenal. The man who killed one of America's founding fathers is about to try to kill America itself, or at least carve off a piece of it large enough to call his own kingdom. You're sitting in a dimly lit tavern in Philadelphia, the kind of place where the ale is questionable and the conversations are even more so. The year is 1805, and you're watching Aaron Burr conduct what can only be described as a job interview for treason. Across from him sits a collection of men who look like they've stepped out of a pirate movie. Weather-beaten faces, calculating eyes, and the kind of moral flexibility that comes from spending too much time on the frontier where law and order are more like polite suggestions. The atmosphere is thick with conspiracy and tobacco smoke, creating the perfect environment for the kind of conversation that would get everyone involved hanged if the wrong person overheard it. You'd probably last about 5 minutes in this crowd before accidentally revealing state secrets or getting yourself recruited into someone else's revolution. But that's what makes it fascinating to observe from the safety of your warm bed centuries. Later, Burr leans forward, his voice barely above a whisper as he outlines his vision. He's not just talking about moving west. Half of America is doing that already. He's talking about creating something entirely new, a nation carved from the vast territories beyond the Mississippi River. Picture the Louisiana Purchase, that massive chunk of land Jefferson bought from Napoleon, except instead of belonging to the United States, it would belong to Aaron Burr, and whoever is smart enough to follow him into this grand adventure. The plan, as you piece it together from these clandestine meetings, is breathtakingly audacious. Burr envisions establishing a new country in the Western Territories, possibly including parts of Spanish-controlled Mexico and Florida. Think of it as the ultimate real estate development project, except instead of building shopping malls, he's planning to build kingdoms. The logistics alone would give modern project managers nightmares, but Burr discusses it with the casual confidence of someone planning a dinner party. You watch as he spreads crude maps across the scarred wooden table, his finger tracing potential boundaries, while his audience leans in like conspirators planning a bank heist. The Mississippi River becomes a highway to empire, the Ohio River a potential northern border, and the vast Louisiana Territory transforms from American acquisition to Burr's personal playground. It's the kind of grand thinking that would be impressive if it weren't completely treasonous. The men gathered around Burr represent a fascinating cross-section of early American malcontents. There's Harmon Blennerhassett, an Irish aristocrat with more money than sense who owns a private island in the Ohio River, and apparently thinks funding revolutions is a reasonable investment strategy. You can almost see him calculating the return on investment of overthrowing governments, which is either brilliant or completely insane depending on your perspective. Then there's Samuel Swartwout, a New York merchant who's managed to accumulate debts faster than a gambling addict in Las Vegas. For him, Burr's scheme represents a chance to escape his creditors by literally creating a new country where his old debts don't apply. It's like declaring bankruptcy, except instead of just ruining your credit score, you're potentially ruining the United States. What's particularly remarkable about these meetings is how Burr manages to make his scheme sound almost reasonable. You listen as he explains how the Western Territories are barely governed by Washington, how local populations might welcome independence from distant federal control, and how European powers, particularly Spain, might be willing to support American separatists for their own strategic reasons. He's not wrong about any of these points, which makes his conspiracy simultaneously brilliant and terrifying. The timeline Burr proposes moves with the urgency of someone who understands that windows of opportunity don't stay open forever. He talks about gathering followers throughout 1805, establishing supply bases along the Mississippi River, and launching his movement by early 1806. It's the kind of aggressive schedule that would make modern startup founders jealous, except instead of disrupting industries, he's planning to disrupt nations. You're present for discussions about funding that would make venture capitalists blush. Burr estimates he'll need somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, astronomical sums in 1805 money, to properly equip and supply his movement. For context, that's roughly equivalent to spending $20 to $40 million today on what amounts to a very expensive midlife crisis with geopolitical consequences. The recruitment strategy reveals Burr's sophisticated understanding of human motivation. He's not looking for idealistic revolutionaries or passionate patriots. Instead, he's targeting debt-ridden farmers facing foreclosure, young men seeking adventure and fortune, and anyone who feels the federal government has failed them personally. It's like building an army of people who have nothing to lose, which historically tends to be either very effective or very dangerous, and sometimes both. But here's where things get really interesting, and where historians still debate Burr's true intentions. Some of his conversations suggest he's planning to establish an independent republic based on democratic principles, a kind of improved United States without the political compromises that frustrated him. Other discussions hint at something more monarchical, with Burr himself as the founding ruler of his new nation. It's like he's simultaneously planning to become George Washington and King George III, which is either visionary or completely contradictory. The geographic scope of Burr's ambitions expands with each meeting you observe. Initial discussions focus on the Louisiana Territory, but gradually encompass parts of Spanish Florida, portions of Mexico, and potentially even the Ohio River Valley. You watch his finger trace increasingly ambitious boundaries on maps, as if claiming territory, were as simple as drawing lines on paper. It's the kind of optimism that would be admirable if it weren't potentially catastrophic. What makes these planning sessions particularly surreal is how they're conducted with the same business-like efficiency you'd expect from corporate executives planning a merger. There are discussions of logistics, supply chains, communication networks, and command structures. Burr approaches treason with the methodical precision of someone who's spent his career in law and politics, which somehow makes it both more professional and more frightening. The conspiracy that's taking shape in these smoky taverns represents something unprecedented in American history. Never before has someone with Burr's political experience and social connections attempted to literally carve a new nation from existing American territory. It's not just rebellion, it's secession with imperial ambitions, wrapped in enough legal and political sophistication to make it seem almost legitimate. As winter turns to spring in 1805, you watch Aaron Burr transform from a disgraced politician into something far more dangerous. A man with a plan, resources, and just enough credibility to make his impossible dream seem achievable. The conspiracy is no longer just an idea. It's becoming an organization, complete with recruitment networks, supply chains, and enough ambition to reshape the North American continent. You're standing in the shadows of a New Orleans courtyard, watching one of the most bizarre diplomatic meetings in American history unfold. The Spanish moss hangs like curtains of secrecy, and the humid air carries whispers in multiple languages, English, Spanish, and French, all mixing together like ingredients in a conspiracy soup that would give modern intelligence agencies indigestion. It's 1805, and Aaron Burr is about to discover that international relations can be just as treacherous as domestic politics, except the stakes involve entire countries instead of just careers. The Spanish connection to Burr's conspiracy reads like something out of a spy novel. If spy novels were written by people who thought espionage should be conducted in broad daylight with all the subtlety of a carnival parade, you'd probably blow your cover within minutes by asking too many obvious questions. But that's exactly what makes this historical moment so deliciously absurd to witness from the comfort of your modern perspective. Across the courtyard sits Don Carlos Martinez de Irujo, the Spanish minister to the United States, a man whose job description apparently includes facilitate the potential dismemberment of neighboring countries. He's the kind of diplomat who makes Machiavelli look like an amateur, conducting foreign policy with the same casual ruthlessness that others might use to plan a garden party. The fact that he's meeting with a wanted man to discuss carving up North America suggests that international law in 1805 was more like international suggestions. The Spanish position is beautifully logical in its complete amorality. Spain controls vast territories in Mexico and Florida, but they're expensive to maintain and difficult to defend. If Aaron Burr wants to create an independent nation that would serve as a buffer between Spanish territories and the expanding United States, well, that sounds like someone else solving Spain's problems for them. It's like having your annoying neighbor's fence fall down and deciding to help them rebuild it. Except the fence is made of countries and the rebuilding involves potential warfare. You listen to Burr pitch his vision with the enthusiasm of a real estate developer selling swampland in Florida. He explains how his new nation would be naturally aligned with Spanish interests, how it would prevent American expansion westward, and how it might even be willing to purchase additional territory from Spain at favorable rates. It's the kind of sales presentation that would make modern consultants take notes, except the product being sold is sedition with a side of international incident. The money discussions are where things get really interesting and where you start to understand the sheer scale of Burr's ambitions. The Spanish are apparently willing to provide substantial financial backing. Estimates range from $100,000 to $500,000, which translates to roughly $2 to $10 million in today's money. For context, that's enough to fund a small war or a very expensive political campaign, and Burr is essentially getting both. But here's where the Spanish prove they're not just throwing money at the first charming American who promises to cause trouble. They want guarantees, detailed plans, and evidence that Burr can actually deliver on his promises. You watch as the negotiations take on the character of a very polite interrogation, with Spanish officials probing every aspect of Burr's conspiracy, like investors conducting due diligence on a startup. Except the startup involves overthrowing governments, The geographic discussions reveal just how fluid national boundaries were considered to be in the early 1800s. Maps are spread across tables like battle plans, with various officials drawing potential borders with the casual confidence of people dividing up a pizza. Louisiana here, Texas there, maybe a slice of Florida for dessert. It's the kind of territorial shopping that would trigger international incidents today, but was apparently just Tuesday afternoon entertainment in 1805. What makes these Spanish meetings particularly fascinating is how they expose the precarious nature of early American expansion. The United States in 1805 is still a relatively weak nation, barely 30 years old and struggling to govern the territory it already claims. The idea that a well-funded and strategically located separatist movement could actually succeed wasn't completely crazy. It was just crazy enough to work, which is precisely what made it dangerous. You're present for discussions about timing. That would make military strategists nervous. The Spanish want Burr to launch his movement during a period when the United States is distracted by other conflicts, preferably when relations between America and European powers are strained. It's like planning a bank robbery during a police convention. The timing has to be absolutely perfect, or everyone involved ends up in prison. The communication networks established during these meetings reveal a level of international coordination that would impress modern intelligence agencies. Secret codes, trusted couriers, and clandestine meetings are arranged with the efficiency of a well-run corporation, except the corporation is in the business of potential treason and international warfare. Messages flow between New Orleans, Washington, Madrid, and various points along the Mississippi River, like a primitive internet designed specifically for sedition. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Spanish connection is how it transforms Burr's conspiracy from a domestic American problem into an international crisis waiting to happen. What started as one man's response to political exile has become a potential flashpoint that could involve the United States, Spain, Britain, and France in a conflict that might redraw the map of North America. It's like watching a small argument escalate into a world war, except the argument is about whether Aaron Burr gets to be king of his own country. The Spanish officials, you observe, seem to understand that they're playing with fire, but they're confident they can control the flames. Their strategy appears to be supporting Burr just enough to cause problems for the United States, but not so much that they become directly implicated in any actual revolution. It's the kind of delicate balance that works perfectly until it doesn't. And then everyone involved spends the rest of their careers explaining how it seemed like a good idea at the time. As these meetings progress through the summer of 1805, you watch Aaron Burr gain something he's lacked since Hamilton's death: powerful allies with substantial resources. The Spanish connection doesn't just provide money, it provides legitimacy, international recognition, and the kind of backing that transforms a domestic conspiracy into a geopolitical movement. Remember those tavern meetings with debt-ridden farmers and adventurous merchants? They're about to be upgraded to an international conspiracy with diplomatic support and foreign funding. What's particularly chilling about these Spanish negotiations is how they reveal the fragility of the early American Republic. The idea that a foreign power could sponsor the breakup of the United States wasn't theoretical. It was actively being planned by professional diplomats with substantial budgets and sophisticated intelligence networks. Aaron Burr's personal grievances have become a tool of Spanish foreign policy, and that makes his conspiracy infinitely more dangerous than anyone in Washington realizes. You're riding through the muddy backroads of Kentucky and Tennessee, watching Aaron Burr work his magic on crowds of people who have every reason to believe the American dream has forgotten them entirely. It's 1805, and these frontier communities exist in a state of perpetual economic anxiety that would make modern recession fears look like minor inconveniences. You probably couldn't last a week in their world of subsistence farming and constant debt, but that's exactly what makes them perfect recruits for someone promising a fresh start in a brand new country. The people Burr is targeting represent the forgotten underbelly of early American expansion. Families who moved west seeking opportunity, but found only hardship. Young men with no prospects beyond backbreaking labor, and anyone who's discovered that the land of the free can be surprisingly expensive. These are individuals who owe money to banks they've never seen, governed by officials they've never met, and taxed by a government that seems to exist primarily to make their lives more difficult. You watch Burr address a gathering in a Tennessee barn. His polished appearance and sophisticated manner completely at odds with his rough-hewn audience. He doesn't look like someone who belongs in this setting. His clothes are too fine, his hands too soft, his accent too refined, but somehow he manages to speak their language, translating his grand imperial ambitions into terms that resonate with people whose primary concern is keeping food on the table and creditors at bay. The recruitment pitch is masterfully calibrated to appeal to different types of desperation. For the debt-ridden farmers, Burr offers a chance to escape their creditors by literally leaving the country, not by fleeing to another nation, but by creating a new one where their old obligations simply don't exist. It's like declaring bankruptcy on a national scale, except instead of just ruining your credit, you're potentially becoming a founding citizen of a new republic. Young men without prospects hear something entirely different in Burr's speeches. He paints pictures of vast territories waiting to be claimed, of military glory and political advancement, of the kind of opportunities that only exist during the founding of nations, for men whose greatest ambition might be owning their own. Farm Burr is offering the chance to become generals, governors, or even senators in his new empire. It's like promising minimum wage workers that they can become CEOs, except the company being founded is a country. What makes Burr's recruitment so effective is how he tailors his message to local grievances without ever explicitly advocating treason. You listen to him complain about distant government officials who don't understand frontier life, about taxes that benefit coastal cities at the expense of Western communities, about policies that seem designed to keep the West weak and dependent. He's not technically calling for revolution. He's just agreeing with everyone's existing complaints and suggesting there might be better alternatives. The logistics of building a revolutionary army from scratch would challenge modern military recruiters, but Burr approaches it with the methodical efficiency of someone who's spent years in politics, understanding how to organize people around shared interests. He establishes networks of local supporters who can identify potential recruits, creates communication systems for coordinating activities across vast distances, and develops supply chains for moving equipment and materials without attracting government attention. You're present for meetings where ordinary farmers and merchants discuss military strategy with the seriousness of professional soldiers. These aren't trained warriors. They're people who've learned to fight out of necessity, defending their homes against everything from wild animals to hostile neighbors. But Burr recognizes that frontier toughness, combined with proper organization and equipment, could form the backbone of an effective fighting force. The financial incentives Burr offers reveal his sophisticated understanding of economic motivation. He's not just promising adventure or glory, he's offering concrete benefits that address his recruits' immediate problems. Land grants in the new territory, forgiveness of debts, military pay that's actually delivered on time, and the kind of economic opportunities that come from being early participants in a growing nation. It's like offering stock options in a startup, except the startup is potentially treasonous. But here's where things get particularly interesting, and where historians still debate the true nature of Burr's intentions. Some of his recruitment efforts suggest he's planning a legitimate colonization effort, possibly with government approval, that would establish new settlements in the Louisiana Territory. Other activities clearly indicate preparation for armed rebellion against the United States. It's like he's simultaneously planning a peaceful migration and a military invasion, which is either brilliant misdirection or dangerous confusion. You observe the careful balance Burr maintains between inspiring his followers and avoiding explicit statements that could be used as evidence of treason. He speaks in generalities about new opportunities in the West and freedom from Eastern tyranny, without ever directly advocating the overthrow of the federal government. It's the kind of political doublespeak that would make modern politicians envious, except the stakes involve potential execution for treason rather than just lost elections. The social dynamics of Burr's recruitment efforts reveal fascinating insights into early American identity. Many of his followers don't see themselves as betraying the United States. They see themselves as fulfilling its promise in a way that the current government has failed to do. They're not anti-American. They're pro-American in a way that requires creating a better America than the one that currently exists. It's the kind of patriotic rebellion that makes perfect sense until you remember it's still rebellion. The weapons acquisition that accompanies Burr's recruitment efforts would raise eyebrows at modern gun shows. But in 1805, it's just good frontier planning. Rifles, ammunition, and basic military equipment are purchased through legitimate channels and stored in locations throughout the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. You watch as Burr's conspiracy accumulates the tools of war while maintaining the appearance of peaceful settlement preparation. The timeline for Burr's recruitment reveals the urgency driving his entire operation. He needs to gather enough followers to make his movement viable before the federal government realizes what he's planning. But he also needs to avoid moving so quickly that he attracts unwanted attention. It's like planning a surprise party for the entire western United States, except the surprise involves potential warfare, and the guests might end up getting hanged for treason. As summer turns to fall in 1805, you watch Aaron Burr's conspiracy transform from a collection of tavern conversations into something resembling an actual movement. His recruitment efforts have identified hundreds of potential followers, established supply networks across multiple states, and created the organizational infrastructure needed to coordinate a large-scale operation. Remember those Spanish negotiations and their promises of financial support? They're about to meet an American conspiracy that's becoming sophisticated enough to actually use that support effectively. The most unsettling aspect of watching Burr recruit his followers is how reasonable his arguments sound when you're surrounded by people who genuinely have been failed by their government. These aren't evil people or natural rebels. They're ordinary Americans who've been pushed to the point where creating a new country seems like a more practical solution than trying to fix the one they're currently stuck with. You're standing in the elegant parlor of General James Wilkinson's New Orleans mansion, watching one of the most sophisticated double agents in American history conduct what might be the most elaborate con game ever perpetrated against a conspiracy. The year is 1806, and you're about to witness the moment when Aaron Burr's grand imperial dreams collide with the reality that his most trusted military ally has been selling him out to Thomas Jefferson from the very beginning. It's like watching someone plan a surprise party while their best friend secretly invites the police, except the party involves treason and the police have hanging on their minds. General Wilkinson cuts an impressive figure, tall, commanding, with the kind of military bearing that inspires confidence in subordinates and terror in enemies. He's exactly the type of person you'd want leading your revolutionary army, which is precisely why Aaron Burr trusted him completely and why Thomas Jefferson found him so useful as a spy. You probably wouldn't last 5 minutes trying to figure out whose side he's really on, but that's what makes him the perfect double agent for this historically absurd situation. The conversations you observe between Burr and Wilkinson are masterclasses in deception, with both men saying exactly what the other wants to hear while pursuing completely different agendas. Burr sees Wilkinson as his military commander for the conquest of Mexico and the establishment of a Western empire. Wilkinson sees Burr as a useful source of intelligence about separatist movements that he can report to Washington while positioning himself as the heroic defender of American unity. It's like watching two poker players who think they're both bluffing when only one of them actually has cards. Wilkinson's credentials for leading a revolutionary movement are impeccable on paper. He's a former Revolutionary War officer, the commanding general of the U.S. Army, and the military governor of the Louisiana Territory. He knows every fort, every supply depot, and every military weakness between the Atlantic coast and the Mexican border. If you were planning to carve a new nation out of American territory, James Wilkinson would be exactly the kind of ally you'd pray to recruit. What Burr doesn't know, and what makes these meetings simultaneously hilarious and terrifying, is that Wilkinson has been on the Spanish payroll for years, receiving regular payments for intelligence about American military activities. The man Burr trusts to help him establish an independent nation allied with Spain is already being paid by Spain to spy on the United States. It's the kind of multiple betrayal that would make soap opera writers blush, except the consequences involve the potential dissolution of the American Republic. You watch Wilkinson carefully take notes during their planning sessions, ostensibly recording details for future military operations, but actually documenting evidence that he'll later present to President Jefferson as proof of Burr's treasonous intentions. Every strategic discussion, every financial arrangement, every recruitment plan is being methodically catalogued by someone who's already decided that Aaron Burr represents a threat that must be eliminated rather than an opportunity that should be embraced. The military aspects of Burr's conspiracy that Wilkinson helps plan are genuinely impressive in their scope and sophistication. You observe discussions about capturing New Orleans, securing control of the Mississippi River, and launching coordinated attacks on Spanish territories in Mexico and Florida. The strategy combines legitimate military tactics with political calculation, recognizing that success would require not just winning battles, but maintaining popular support among civilian populations, who might prefer independence to distant government control. Wilkinson's contributions to the conspiracy reveal his deep understanding of American military weaknesses. He identifies which forts are undermanned, which supply lines are vulnerable, and which commanders might be sympathetic to separatist causes. It's exactly the kind of insider information that would make Burr's conspiracy viable, which is precisely why Wilkinson makes sure to share it. He needs the conspiracy to seem credible enough to justify the dramatic measures he's planning to take against it. The financial discussions between Burr and Wilkinson expose the sheer scale of corruption that characterized early American politics. Wilkinson is simultaneously receiving payments from Spain for espionage, salary from the United States for military service, and promises of future wealth from Burr for revolutionary leadership. He's like a political mercenary working for multiple employers who don't know about each other, except all of his employers are governments, and the work involves potential warfare. You're present for conversations where Wilkinson helps Burr refine his timeline for launching the conspiracy. The general suggests waiting until spring 1807, when river travel would be easier, and when political tensions between the United States and European powers might provide cover for military action. It's sound strategic advice that happens to give Wilkinson more time to coordinate with Jefferson's administration for the most effective response to Burr's movement. The communications network that Wilkinson helps establish for the conspiracy becomes the very system through which he betrays it. Coded messages, trusted couriers, and secret meeting locations are all designed to keep Burr's plans hidden from government authorities, but they're also perfect tools for keeping those same authorities informed about every aspect of the conspiracy. It's like building a security system that secretly reports to the people you're trying to keep out. What makes Wilkinson's double game particularly sophisticated is how he manages to encourage Burr's conspiracy while simultaneously preparing to destroy it. He provides just enough genuine assistance to maintain Burr's trust, while carefully documenting evidence that will eventually be used to prosecute the conspiracy's participants. He's not just betraying Burr, he's methodically building the case that will be used to convict him. The psychological dynamics between Burr and Wilkinson reveal fascinating insights into the nature of trust and betrayal in high-stakes political conspiracies. Burr, desperate for powerful allies after his social exile, sees in Wilkinson the military credibility and institutional connections his movement needs to succeed. Wilkinson, calculating the political wins, recognizes that his best chance for advancement lies in being the man who saves the Republic from Aaron Burr rather than the man who helps destroy it. As winter approaches in 1806, you watch the final pieces of this elaborate deception fall into place. Wilkinson has gathered enough intelligence about Burr's conspiracy to convince Jefferson that dramatic action is necessary, while simultaneously encouraging Burr to believe that military success is within reach. The stage is being set for a confrontation that will destroy Burr's imperial dreams and establish Wilkinson as one of the most successful double agents in American history. Remember those Spanish negotiations that provided funding for Burr's conspiracy? Wilkinson knows about them because he helped facilitate them while simultaneously reporting them to Washington. Remember those recruitment efforts that gathered hundreds of potential followers? Wilkinson has detailed lists of participants that he's prepared to share with federal authorities. The man Aaron Burr trusts most has become the architect of his downfall, and the conspiracy that seemed so promising is about to collapse under the weight of its own betrayed secrets. You're floating down the Mississippi River on a crisp November morning in 1806, surrounded by the most pathetic flotilla in the history of American rebellion. What Aaron Burr envisioned as a mighty armada conquering the Western territories has devolved into roughly 10 boats carrying fewer than 100 men, most of whom seem more interested in the free meals than the imperial conquest. It's like watching someone launch a yacht club instead of a navy, except the yacht club thinks it's going to overthrow governments and establish kingdoms. You'd probably be more intimidating paddling down the river in a canoe by yourself, but that's what makes this moment so tragically absurd. The boats themselves tell the story of a conspiracy that's already failing before it's properly begun. Instead of military vessels bristling with cannon, you're looking at converted barges, leaky riverboats, and what appears to be at least one craft that was obviously designed for hauling grain rather than hauling revolutionaries. The supplies are equally underwhelming. Instead of the weapons of war that Burr promised, there are farming tools, household goods, and enough confusion about the actual mission to power a small comedy festival. Burr himself maintains an air of confident command that would be impressive if it weren't so completely divorced from reality. You watch him stride from boat to boat, encouraging his followers with speeches about manifest destiny and imperial glory, while carefully avoiding any mention of the fact that his great revolutionary army could probably be defeated by a determined group of customs officials. He's like a general reviewing troops that exist primarily in his imagination, except the imagination involves real boats on a real river heading toward real trouble. The followers Burr has managed to assemble represent a fascinating cross-section of American optimism and desperation. There are young men seeking adventure who clearly expected something more military and less agricultural in their revolutionary experience. There are families hoping to establish farms in new territories who seem genuinely confused about why everyone keeps talking about conquest and empire. And there are a few genuine believers in Burr's vision who are beginning to wonder if perhaps they've made a terrible mistake. What's particularly striking about this river journey is how it exposes the gap between Burr's grandiose rhetoric and his practical capabilities. The man who promised to establish a Western empire has managed to assemble what amounts to an unusually well-armed pioneer expedition. Instead of conquering Mexico, his flotilla looks more likely to get lost looking for suitable camping spots. It's the kind of anticlimax that would be funny if it weren't potentially treasonous. The logistics of moving even this small group down the Mississippi reveal how woefully unprepared Burr's conspiracy really was. Food runs short, equipment breaks down, and coordination between boats becomes increasingly chaotic as the journey progresses. You watch grown men arguing about navigation while their leader maintains that they're participating in a historic conquest that will reshape the North American continent. It's like watching a very expensive camping trip that's gotten completely out of hand. The communications Burr receives during the journey paint an increasingly dire picture of his conspiracy's prospects. Messages from supporters throughout the Ohio and Mississippi valleys report that federal authorities are asking uncomfortable questions, that local officials are becoming suspicious, and that the promised reinforcements are mysteriously failing to materialize. Each update chips away at the foundation of Burr's imperial dreams, but he continues to act as if everything is proceeding according to plan. You're present for evening meetings around campfires, where Burr attempts to maintain morale among followers, who are beginning to realize that their revolutionary army consists primarily of themselves. He speaks passionately about the territories they're going to claim and the governments they're going to establish, while carefully avoiding specifics about how exactly 10 boats are going to accomplish what would challenge a proper military force. It's the kind of motivational speaking that would be inspiring if the audience weren't slowly figuring out that their leader might be slightly delusional. The river itself becomes a metaphor for Burr's entire conspiracy. It carries them forward, with irresistible force toward a destination that becomes less appealing the closer they get to it. The Mississippi in 1806 is a highway to opportunity for legitimate settlers and merchants, but for Burr's flotilla, it's becoming a river of no return that's carrying them toward either glory or disaster, with very little middle ground between the two options. What makes this journey particularly poignant is how it represents the death of American innocence about the possibility of individual empire building. Burr belongs to a generation that lived through the Revolutionary War and saw ordinary people create a new nation through sheer determination and political will. His mistake was believing that lightning could strike twice, that the same kind of revolutionary energy that created the United States could be harnessed to create additional United States whenever circumstances seemed favorable. The weather during the journey seems almost deliberately symbolic, cold gray and increasingly ominous as they float deeper into territory where federal authorities are beginning to take notice of their activities. You watch Burr's followers huddle around inadequate fires, eating increasingly monotonous meals, while their leader continues to describe the palaces they'll build in their new empire. It's like watching someone plan a beach vacation during a hurricane, except the hurricane involves potential treason charges. The military preparations that were supposed to make this flotilla formidable are revealed to be almost comically inadequate. Instead of the disciplined revolutionary force Burr envisioned, you're looking at a collection of individuals who seem more likely to injure themselves than any enemy they might encounter. Their weapons are a mixture of hunting rifles and farming tools. Their military knowledge consists primarily of stories they've heard about the Revolutionary War, and their command structure appears to be based on whoever talks the loudest during arguments. As the flotilla drifts past settlements along the river, you watch the reactions of ordinary Americans who are witnessing what they're beginning to realize might be the strangest military expedition in their nation's history. Some wave from the shore, assuming they're looking at ordinary settlers heading west. Others seem confused by the combination of military posturing and obvious unpreparedness. A few appear to be making mental notes that they'll later share with federal authorities who are very interested in Aaron Burr's current activities. The most tragic aspect of this river journey is how it represents the moment when Burr's conspiracy transitions from dangerous threat to historical curiosity. What began as a sophisticated plan involving international financing, military leadership, and political strategy has devolved into what looks suspiciously like an expensive midlife crisis being conducted on public waterways. Remember General Wilkinson's promises of military support? They're conspicuously absent from this flotilla, along with the Spanish funding, the recruited army, and most of the other elements that were supposed to make Burr's revolution actually revolutionary. But here's the thing that makes this failure so fascinating. Burr still doesn't know his conspiracy has been betrayed. As his pathetic flotilla drifts toward what will become one of the most famous trials in American history, he continues to believe that he's leading a revolutionary movement rather than providing evidence for his own prosecution. The river that was supposed to carry him to empire is actually carrying him to prison, and he won't realize it until it's far too late to turn back. You're standing in the White House on a cold January morning in 1807, watching Thomas Jefferson make what might be the most consequential presidential decision since George Washington chose to step down after 2 terms. The man who wrote the Declaration of Independence is about to declare war on one of his own former vice presidents, and he's doing it with the kind of calculated political precision that would make modern spin doctors weep with envy. You'd probably panic and call a committee meeting to discuss forming a task force to evaluate the situation, but Jefferson moves with the decisive clarity of someone who's been waiting for this moment ever since Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton. The intelligence briefings Jefferson receives from General Wilkinson read like something out of a spy thriller. If spy thrillers were written by people who thought subtlety was for weaklings, maps showing Burr's route down the Mississippi, detailed lists of his followers, copies of correspondence discussing territorial conquest. It's a prosecutor's dream and a defendant's nightmare. all delivered by the very man Burr trusted most. The irony is so thick, you could cut it with a knife, which is probably what Burr would like to do to Wilkinson if he knew what was coming. Jefferson's cabinet meetings during this period reveal a fascinating glimpse into how early American democracy handled existential threats. You watch the Secretary of War, the Attorney General, and other top officials debate whether Burr's pathetic flotilla actually constitutes a threat to national security or just an elaborate form of political suicide. The consensus seems to be that while Burr might not be capable of actually overthrowing the government, he's definitely stupid enough to try, which makes him dangerous in an entirely different way. The legal challenges facing Jefferson are unprecedented in American history. How do you prosecute someone for treason when their treasonous act consists primarily of floating down a river with farming equipment? How do you prove conspiracy when the conspiracy appears to have been more successful at conspirating than at actually accomplishing anything? These are the kinds of constitutional questions that law schools would spend decades debating. Except Jefferson needs answers immediately, and preferably ones that result in Aaron Burr being permanently removed from American politics. You're present for the moment when Jefferson decides to issue a presidential proclamation declaring Burr and his followers to be enemies of the United States. It's like issuing a warrant for someone's arrest before they've technically committed a crime. Except the crime they're planning to commit is overthrowing the government, and the evidence suggests they're too incompetent to actually do it. The proclamation is simultaneously an overreaction and an underreaction, which perfectly captures the surreal nature of the entire Burr conspiracy. The writing of Jefferson's proclamation reveals his sophisticated understanding of political theater. The document doesn't just declare Burr a traitor. It tells a story about foreign influence, domestic conspiracy, and threats to Republican government that transforms a relatively minor separatist movement into an existential crisis requiring decisive presidential action. It's the kind of political messaging that would make modern communications directors take notes, except the message involves potentially executing a former vice president. What makes Jefferson's response particularly brilliant is how it frames Burr's conspiracy as simultaneously laughable and terrifying. The proclamation acknowledges that Burr's actual capabilities are limited, but argues that his intentions are so dangerous that they require immediate and overwhelming response. It's like calling the fire department to put out a candle, except the candle is being held by someone who's explicitly planning to burn down the entire neighborhood. The speed with which Jefferson's proclamation spreads throughout the United States reveals the efficiency of early American communication networks when they're properly motivated. Within days, every newspaper in the country is reporting that the former vice president is leading an armed rebellion against the United States. The story gets embellished with each retelling, so that by the time it reaches frontier communities, Aaron Burr has apparently assembled an army of thousands preparing to invade Mexico and establish himself as Emperor of North America. You watch. The public reaction to Jefferson's proclamation unfold like a real-time opinion poll, conducted through newspaper editorials and tavern conversations. The response is overwhelmingly supportive of the president, but for fascinating reasons that reveal deep currents in early American political culture. People aren't just angry at Burr for attempting treason, they're angry at him for attempting such incompetent treason that it makes American republicanism look foolish. The military response coordinated by Jefferson and his cabinet transforms Burr's conspiracy from a potential threat into a manhunt. Federal authorities throughout the Ohio and Mississippi valleys receive orders to arrest anyone associated with Burr's movement, while military commanders are instructed to treat his flotilla as an armed rebellion requiring immediate suppression. It's like mobilizing the National Guard to arrest a particularly ambitious book club, except the book club is reading military strategy and discussing territorial conquest. The international implications of Jefferson's proclamation extend far beyond American borders. Spanish officials who were secretly funding Burr's conspiracy suddenly find themselves exposed as foreign powers interfering in American domestic affairs. British agents who were monitoring the situation for their own strategic purposes discover that their intelligence networks have been compromised, French diplomats who thought they were observing a minor political disturbance realized they're witnessing a constitutional crisis that could reshape North American geopolitics. What's particularly fascinating about Jefferson's handling of the Burr conspiracy is how it establishes precedents for presidential power that will echo through American history. The proclamation asserts the president's authority to declare domestic threats, coordinate federal law enforcement, and mobilize military resources against American citizens, powers that aren't explicitly granted by the Constitution but seem necessary for protecting constitutional government. It's the kind of expansion of executive authority that would make civil libertarians nervous, except the alternative is letting former vice presidents establish their own countries whenever they feel like it. The timing of Jefferson's proclamation reveals his sophisticated understanding of political opportunity. By acting decisively against Burr, he simultaneously demonstrates strong leadership, eliminates a potential rival, and establishes himself as the defender of Republican institutions against both foreign influence and domestic conspiracy. It's the kind of political triple play that transforms a potential crisis into a demonstration of presidential competence. The language Jefferson uses in his proclamation carefully balances legal precision with political drama. The document provides enough specific detail about Burr's activities to justify extraordinary measures, while maintaining enough ambiguity about his ultimate intentions to avoid appearing to prosecute someone for thought crimes. It's the kind of careful legal drafting that would make modern prosecutors envious, except the prosecutor is the President of the United States and the defendant is floating down the Mississippi River with farming equipment. As news of Jefferson's proclamation reaches Aaron Burr somewhere along the Mississippi River, you watch the moment when his imperial dreams collide with political reality. The man who thought he was leading a revolutionary movement discovers that he's actually the target of a federal manhunt, and his pathetic flotilla has become evidence in a treason case that could cost him his life. Remember those Spanish negotiations? That was supposed to provide international legitimacy for his new nation. They've just become proof of foreign conspiracy against the United States. The most chilling aspect of Jefferson's proclamation is how it demonstrates the fragility of political reputation in early American democracy. Aaron Burr began this story as a respected politician who served as Vice President of the United States. One duel and one poorly planned conspiracy later, he's been declared an enemy of the nation he once helped govern. It's the kind of dramatic fall that would make Shakespeare jealous, except Shakespeare never had to worry about his protagonists actually being executed for treason. You're standing in the Alabama forests, and you can almost hear the Spanish moss whispering secrets as it brushes against your shoulders. The Alabama wilderness stretches endlessly before you, thick with the kind of humidity that makes your shirt cling like a guilty conscience. You're Aaron Burr now, former Vice President of the United States, and you're running for your life through forests that couldn't care less about your political pedigree. Your boots squelch in the muddy undergrowth, each step a reminder that you've fallen spectacularly from grace. Just months ago, you were dining with senators and plotting grand schemes. Now, you're swatting mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds and wondering if that rustling behind you is a bear or a bounty hunter. It's February 1807, and Thomas Jefferson wants your head on a platter. Metaphorically speaking, of course, though you're not entirely sure about that metaphorically part. The irony isn't lost on you that the man who once stood second in command of a nation is now dressed like a riverboat captain, complete with a slouch hat pulled low over your eyes. Your disguise would make a theater costume department weep. Ill-fitting clothes, a fake beard that itches worse than poison ivy, and boots that squeak with every step. You look less like a mastermind and more like someone who raided a scarecrow's wardrobe. But here's what most history books won't tell you. Burr was actually a surprisingly competent woodsman. Years of military service during the Revolutionary War had taught him to navigate by the stars and live off the land. While other politicians of his era would have been helplessly lost after 5 minutes in the wilderness, Burr could identify edible plants and track game with the best of them. He wasn't just some pampered aristocrat stumbling through the woods. He was a survivor with actual skills. You pause by a creek, cupping the cool water in your hands. the sound of flowing water masks, the approach of footsteps, and for a moment, you allow yourself to believe you might actually escape this mess. After all, you've talked your way out of duels, political scandals, and bankruptcy. Surely you can outwit a few federal marshals in the middle of nowhere, right? The plan had seemed so elegant back in civilization. Head south towards Spanish Florida, where American law enforcement held about as much authority as a chocolate teapot. The Spanish territories were like the Wild West of diplomatic immunity, a place where inconvenient Americans could disappear faster than free samples at Costco. All you had to do was reach that invisible line on the map, and you'd be home free. But the wilderness has its own plans, and they rarely align with human ambition. Spanish moss dangles like nature's curtains, creating shadows that play tricks on your paranoid mind. Every snapped twig sounds like a musket being cocked. Every bird call could be a signal between your pursuers. You're developing the kind of hypervigilance that would make a Secret Service agent proud. If Secret Service agents existed yet, which they don't, because apparently presidents in 1807 were expected to fend for themselves. What's particularly maddening is how this whole conspiracy charge came about. Sure, you'd been corresponding with General James Wilkinson about potentially establishing an independent nation in the Southwest. And yes, you'd recruited men and boats for what you claimed was a legitimate colonization venture. But treason? The evidence was flimsy enough to use as gift wrap. Yet here you are running through Alabama like some common criminal. Historians still debate whether Burr was actually planning to split the Union or simply trying to establish a legitimate settlement in the Louisiana Territory. The man himself never gave a straight answer, which was probably smart legal strategy, but terrible for his historical reputation. Was he a treasonous mastermind or just an ambitious entrepreneur with poor timing? The jury's still out, literally and figuratively. You stumble over a route that seems strategically placed by a forest with a sense of humor. The mud squelches around your boots with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for quicksand in adventure movies. This isn't exactly how you pictured your golden years when you were busy being vice president. Back then, your biggest worry was whether Alexander Hamilton was going to insult you at the next cabinet meeting. Now you're worried about whether that sound was a snake or just your stomach growling. The disguise is starting to feel less like clever subterfuge and more like elaborate self-torture. The fake beard itches with the persistence of a telemarketer, and the oversized coat keeps snagging on every branch in Alabama. You're beginning to suspect that whoever sold you this outfit had never actually seen a riverboat captain, or possibly any human being up close, but you press on because what else can you do? Behind you lies certain imprisonment, and a trial that will either vindicate you or destroy what's left of your reputation. Ahead lies the promise of Spanish territory and the chance to reinvent yourself yet again. You've always been good at reinvention. From war hero to lawyer to politician to alleged conspirator. Maybe Spanish exile will be your next career move. The forest seems to stretch forever, an endless maze of trees that all look suspiciously similar. If trees had personality disorders, these would definitely be the passive-aggressive type, appearing helpful while secretly leading you in circles. Your compass insists you're heading south, but your growing sense of dread suggests you might be walking directly into a trap. What you don't know yet is that your trusted co-conspirator, General Wilkinson, has already betrayed you to save his own skin. He's sitting comfortably in New Orleans right now, probably enjoying a nice meal while you're out here fighting off insects the size of small aircraft. The man who helped plan your Western adventure has thrown you under the carriage with all the loyalty of a politician during election season. This betrayal would sting even more if you knew about it. But for now, ignorance is keeping you moving forward through the Alabama wilderness. You're operating under the assumption that your secret is still safe, that your network of supporters is still intact, and that Spain is still willing to harbor American fugitives. Spoiler alert, you're wrong on all counts, but we'll let you figure that out the hard way. The Spanish border feels both impossibly far and tantalizingly close. Every mile you cover brings you closer to safety, but also deeper into territory where help is scarce and mistakes are fatal. You're walking a tightrope over an abyss, except the tightrope is made of mud, and the abyss is full of federal marshals with arrest warrants. Your legs are starting to protest with the kind of aching that suggests they're considering going on strike. The romantic notion of fleeing through the wilderness is rapidly being replaced by the harsh reality of blisters, mosquito bites, and a growing certainty that you should have taken up a nice, safe profession like lion taming or volcano inspection. But just as you're starting to wonder if this whole escape plan was the worst idea since someone decided to make Aaron Burr the vice president, you hear it. The unmistakable sound of horses approaching through the forest. Multiple horses moving with the kind of purposeful coordination that suggests they're not out for a leisurely trail ride. Your heart hammers against your ribs like it's trying to escape on its own. This is it, the moment that will determine whether you make it to Spanish Florida or end up in chains heading back to face Thomas Jefferson's justice. You crouch behind a fallen log, trying to make yourself invisible while your oversized disguise does everything possible to make you conspicuous. The hoofbeats grow closer, and you can hear voices now. American voices, speaking with the authority of men who have legal paperwork and aren't afraid to use it. Your grand escape through the Alabama wilderness is about to come to an inglorious end, and all you can think is that at least the mosquitoes won't be disappointed to see you go. You enter the Richmond courtroom, where Burr faces treason charges that could cost him his life. The air feels thick with anticipation, like waiting for your Wi-Fi to load when you desperately need to stream something. Every wooden bench creaks under the weight of spectators who've traveled hundreds of miles just to witness what newspapers are calling the most sensational trial in American history. You can practically taste the drama hanging in the humid Virginia air, mixed with the not-so-pleasant aroma of 200 unwashed bodies packed into a space meant for half that number. Aaron Burr sits at the defendant's table, and honestly, he looks surprisingly calm for someone whose neck is literally on the line. His dark eyes scan the room with the confidence of a man who's killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel and lived to tell about it, which, let's be real, is exactly what he did 3 years earlier. You notice how he adjusts his perfectly tailored coat, because apparently even when facing potential execution, fashion matters. Here's something most people don't know. Burr actually designed his own legal defense strategy, essentially becoming his own co-counsel because he trusted no one else with his life. The charges against him sound like something straight out of a Netflix political thriller. President Thomas Jefferson, yes, the same guy who wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, has accused his former vice president of trying to create his own empire in the American West. You watch as the prosecution outlines their case. Burr allegedly planned to seize New Orleans, invade Mexico, and establish himself as emperor of a new nation carved from American territory. It's like if someone today tried to secede with Texas and declare themselves king of the BBQ empire, except with way more actual treason involved. But here's where things get really juicy. And by juicy, I mean historically fascinating in a way that would make your high school history teacher weep with joy. Chief Justice John Marshall, who's presiding over this trial, has a personal vendetta against Jefferson that makes modern political feuds look like playground squabbles. Marshall and Jefferson despise each other with the intensity of two Karens, fighting over the last parking spot at Target. The irony, Jefferson appointed Marshall to the Supreme Court, which is like hiring your ex to be your boss and then acting surprised when they make your life difficult. You lean forward as Marshall explains the legal definition of treason, his voice carrying the weight of constitutional precedent. Under the Constitution, treason requires 2 witnesses to the same overt act or confession in open court. It sounds simple enough, but you're about to discover that proving treason is harder than explaining TikTok to your grandparents. The prosecution's star witness is General James Wilkinson, the military governor of Louisiana Territory, who claims Burr sent him coded letters outlining the conspiracy. What most people don't realize is that Wilkinson was simultaneously a paid spy for Spain, making him about as trustworthy as a chocolate teapot. The prosecution presents what they call the cipher letter, Burr's allegedly treasonous correspondence, written in code. You watch as they decode messages that supposedly prove Burr's guilt, but honestly, the whole thing reads like a group chat between middle schoolers planning an elaborate prank. The coded language is so vague, it could mean anything, from planning a revolution to organizing a particularly ambitious book club. Historians still debate whether these letters actually prove treason or just show that Burr had an overactive imagination and terrible handwriting. As witness after witness takes the stand, you realize this trial is revealing more about American politics than anyone expected. It's like watching a reality TV show where everyone's dirty laundry gets aired, except the stakes involve the future of the nation. Burr's defense argues that he never actually committed an overt act of treason. He just talked a big game, which technically isn't illegal, no matter how annoying it might be. You can see the frustration building in Jefferson's supporters as they realize their slam dunk case is turning into a constitutional law seminar. The courtroom drama intensifies when Marshall rules that conspiracy to commit treason isn't the same as actually committing treason. This distinction matters more than the difference between your and your in a text message. It could literally save Burr's life. The Chief Justice's decision effectively guts the prosecution's case because they've built their entire argument on proving Burr planned treason, not that he actually did it. You watch the prosecutors' faces fall like students realizing they studied for the wrong exam. Here's something that would blow your mind if you lived in 1807. This trial is being covered by newspapers across the country with the intensity of modern social media coverage. People are following every twist and turn like it's their favorite TV series, except instead of binge watching, they're binge reading newspaper articles that arrive days or weeks late. The trial has become America's first real media circus, complete with celebrity witnesses, political intrigue, and enough plot twists to make Shakespeare jealous. What makes this whole situation even more bizarre is that Burr is technically still the sitting vice president during part of the proceedings. Imagine if your current VP got arrested for treason while still in office. It's like finding out your co-worker has been plotting to steal the company while they're sitting in the cubicle next to you. The constitutional implications alone are giving legal scholars nightmares that won't be resolved for decades. You notice how Burr maintains his composure throughout the proceedings, occasionally taking notes with the nonchalance of someone attending. A mildly interesting lecture rather than fighting for his life. This guy has nerves of steel, or maybe he's just really good at compartmentalizing stress. Fun fact that most history books skip. Burr actually used this trial to network, making connections with Virginia's elite that would serve him well in his later years. Only Aaron Burr could turn his treason trial into a networking opportunity. The prosecution's case continues to crumble like a cookie in milk as witness after witness fails to provide the concrete evidence Marshall demands. General Wilkinson's testimony is particularly disastrous. The man is such an obvious liar that even the jury members are rolling their eyes. You can practically see the prosecution team's confidence deflating like a punctured balloon at a kid's party. The whole spectacle is becoming less about justice and more about political theater, with Jefferson pulling strings from Washington like a puppet master whose marionettes keep tangling themselves up. As the trial drags on for months, you begin to understand that this case is really about the limits of presidential power and the independence of the judiciary. Marshall isn't just trying Burr, he's essentially putting Jefferson's administration on trial, questioning whether a president can use the courts as his personal vendetta machine. It's like watching a constitutional crisis unfold in real time, except everyone's wearing powdered wigs and speaking in elaborate 18th century prose. The final verdict arrives with all the anticlimactic energy of a firework that fizzles instead of exploding. Not guilty of treason, though the jury adds they're not convinced of Burr's complete innocence either. Basically the legal equivalent of, we see what you did there, but technically you didn't break the law. You watch as Burr's supporters cheer while his enemies seethe with frustration. The man who killed Hamilton and nearly became Emperor of the West walks free, leaving behind a legal precedent that will protect Americans from overzealous treason prosecutions for centuries to come. The aftermath of this trial reshapes American jurisprudence in ways that still matter today. Marshall's strict interpretation of treason requirements makes it nearly impossible for future presidents to weaponize treason charges against political enemies. Historians still argue about whether Burr was actually guilty of planning something treasonous or just guilty of being Aaron Burr, which, let's be honest, was crime enough in the eyes of many Americans. Either way, You've just witnessed one of the most important trials in American history, where the Constitution itself was both defendant and judge. You observe the constitutional battle between John Marshall and Thomas Jefferson playing out through Burr's trial. And honestly, the tension in this Richmond courtroom is thicker than your aunt's gravy at Thanksgiving dinner. These two men are locked in a political death match that's been brewing for years, using poor Aaron Burr as their unwitting chess piece in a game that will determine the very soul of American democracy. You can practically feel the electricity crackling between the judicial and executive branches, like watching two alphas circle each other at a corporate retreat, except with powdered wigs and the future of constitutional law hanging in the balance. Marshall sits on his judicial throne with the calm confidence of someone who knows he holds all the legal cards, while Jefferson paces the halls of Monticello like a caged tiger, sending increasingly frantic letters to his prosecutors. What most people don't realize is that these two Virginia gentlemen have been feuding since their college days at William and Mary, where they apparently couldn't agree on anything from philosophy to whose turn it was to buy the ale. Their personal animosity has now evolved into a full-blown constitutional crisis that makes modern political Twitter feuds look like polite disagreements over dinner etiquette. You watch as Marshall methodically dismantles every piece of evidence Jefferson's prosecution presents, his voice dripping with the kind of judicial disdain usually reserved for lawyers who show up unprepared. Each ruling feels like a carefully calculated slap in Jefferson's face, delivered with such constitutional authority that even the president can't complain without looking like he's attacking the very foundations of American justice. The Chief Justice is essentially conducting a masterclass in judicial independence, showing everyone exactly why the founders separated the powers of government in the first place. Here's the thing that makes this whole situation absolutely delicious from a constitutional perspective. Jefferson basically created his own worst enemy when he appointed Marshall to the Supreme Court during his final days as president. It's like giving your ex-boyfriend the keys to your house and then acting surprised when he changes all the locks. Adams knew exactly what he was doing when he nominated Marshall in those final midnight hours, essentially giving Jefferson a judicial headache that would last for decades. The irony gets even juicier when you realize that Jefferson, the great champion of limited government, is now trying to use the full power of the federal government to destroy a political enemy. You can see the hypocrisy playing out in real time as the man who wrote about natural rights and individual liberty attempts to stretch the definition of treason like taffy at a county fair. Marshall, meanwhile, is playing the role of constitutional purist, insisting that even unpopular defendants deserve due process, which is either principled jurisprudence or the ultimate revenge, depending on your perspective. What's fascinating is how Marshall turns every procedural ruling into a constitutional lecture, like a law professor who really wants to make sure his students understand the material. When he demands that the prosecution produce actual evidence of overt acts rather than just suspicious behavior, he's not just protecting Burr, he's establishing precedents that will protect all Americans from government overreach. Historians still debate whether Marshall's motivation was pure constitutional principle or pure personal spite. But honestly, does it matter if the result protects individual rights? You notice how Jefferson's team keeps trying to introduce evidence that Marshall systematically excludes, creating a legal obstacle course that would challenge even the most skilled prosecutors. The Chief Justice's rulings are so precise and well-reasoned that they're practically impossible to appeal, which must be driving Jefferson absolutely insane back in Washington. It's like watching someone dismantle an engine with surgical precision while the owner stands there helplessly, knowing they can't argue with the mechanic's expertise. The constitutional implications of what you're witnessing extend far beyond this single trial. Marshall is essentially drawing a line in the sand, telling future presidents that they can't simply weaponize the judicial system against their political enemies. He's creating a firewall between executive ambition and judicial independence that will protect American democracy for generations. What most people don't know is that Marshall actually consulted with other Federalist judges before making his key rulings, essentially creating a unified judicial front against executive overreach. The personal dimension of this conflict adds another layer of complexity that makes soap operas look simple by comparison. These aren't just two politicians disagreeing about policy. They represent fundamentally different visions of what America should become. Jefferson sees himself as the voice of democratic revolution, while Marshall positions himself as the guardian of constitutional order. You're watching the Enlightenment debate itself playing out in an American courtroom, with real consequences for real people. As the trial progresses, you begin to understand that Marshall isn't just ruling on legal motions. He's conducting a seminar on the limits of presidential power. Every time he requires the prosecution to meet constitutional standards, he's essentially telling Jefferson that being president doesn't make you king. The Chief Justice's insistence on proper legal procedures must feel like water torture to an administration that expected a quick conviction and public vindication. The media coverage of this judicial showdown reveals how thoroughly Americans understand the stakes involved. Newspapers across the country are picking sides not just in the Burr case, but in the larger question of whether judges should be independent or subservient to political authority. You can read between the lines of editorial coverage and see that people realize they're witnessing something historically significant, a stress test of American constitutional government that will either strengthen or shatter the separation of powers. What makes Marshall's strategy particularly brilliant is how he uses Jefferson's own democratic rhetoric against him. When the prosecution argues that Burr's alleged conspiracy threatens Republican government, Marshall counters that nothing threatens Republican government more than presidents who ignore constitutional protections. It's like using someone's own words to prove they're contradicting themselves, except with potentially fatal consequences for the defendant and lasting implications for American jurisprudence. You observe how the Chief Justice manages to maintain perfect judicial decorum while essentially giving Jefferson the constitutional equivalent of a public spanking. Marshall never raises his voice or shows obvious bias, but his rulings systematically destroy the prosecution's case with the methodical precision of someone who really knows how to hold a grudge. The fact that he does it all while appearing to serve justice rather than personal vendetta is either remarkable self-control or masterful political theater. The broader historical context makes this confrontation even more significant than it appears on the surface. You're watching the final death throes of Federalist political power, as Marshall uses his lifetime judicial appointment to continue fighting battles his party has already lost at the ballot box. Jefferson represents the new Democratic majority, while Marshall embodies the old conservative establishment's last stand for constitutional formalism over popular will. As witness after witness fails to meet Marshall's evidentiary standards, you can almost hear Jefferson's teeth grinding from 200 miles away. The president has staked his reputation on this prosecution, publicly declaring Burr guilty before the trial even began, which, in retrospect, probably wasn't the smartest political move when facing a Chief Justice who takes constitutional procedure seriously. Historians still argue about whether Jefferson's premature public statements actually strengthened Marshall's resolve to demand absolute proof of guilt. The final verdict represents more than just Burr's acquittal. It's Marshall's definitive victory in his long war with Jefferson over the nature of American government. By requiring strict adherence to constitutional standards, even in cases involving alleged treason, the Chief Justice has essentially declared that no one, not even presidents, can bend the law to serve political purposes. You've just witnessed the birth of modern judicial review, wrapped in the drama of personal rivalry, and delivered with the precision of constitutional law. The precedents established in this Richmond courtroom will echo through American jurisprudence for centuries, proving that sometimes personal feuds can accidentally serve the greater good of democratic government. You discover how the strict legal definition of treason ultimately freed Burr despite overwhelming evidence, and it's honestly one of those moments that makes you appreciate just how precisely the Founding Fathers crafted the Constitution. Picture this. You've got mountains of suspicious letters, sketchy witnesses pointing fingers, and a defendant who literally killed a founding father in a duel. Yet he's about to walk free because of what amounts to the 18th century equivalent of reading the fine print. The whole situation is like watching someone escape a speeding ticket because the officer misspelled their name. Technically correct, but absolutely infuriating for everyone who wanted justice served with a side of dramatic conviction. Chief, Justice Marshall sits there like the world's most pedantic law professor, explaining to a packed courtroom why evidence of planning treason isn't the same as actually committing treason. You can practically see the prosecution team's souls leaving their bodies as Marshall breaks down the constitutional requirements with the methodical precision of someone explaining why your favorite loophole actually works. The Constitution demands either 2 witnesses to the same overt act or confession in open court. Not rumors, not suspicious behavior, not even really damning correspondence that makes Burr look guilty as sin. What most people don't realize is that this strict definition of treason was intentionally designed by men who remembered being called traitors by the British Crown just 30 years earlier. The founders knew exactly how easily treason charges could be weaponized against political enemies, so they made the legal bar so high that it's practically in orbit. You're watching constitutional protection in action, even when it protects someone who probably deserved whatever punishment Jefferson had in mind. Historians still debate whether the founders would have approved of their own handiwork being used to protect someone like Burr, but that's the beauty and frustration of principled legal systems. The prosecution's case crumbles faster than a cookie in hot coffee as Marshall systematically eliminates every piece of evidence that doesn't meet the constitutional standard. General Wilkinson's testimony about coded letters. Interesting, but not an overt act. Witness accounts of suspicious meetings and grandiose plans. Compelling, but still not the same as actually levying war against the United States. You watch the government lawyers' faces fall as they realize their entire case is built on circumstantial evidence that wouldn't convict someone of stealing a candy bar, let alone overthrowing the government. Here's where the legal technicality gets really juicy. Marshall rules that assembling men and materials for potential treason isn't treason, unless those men actually commit an act of war. It's like saying that buying ingredients for a cake doesn't make you a baker until you actually turn on the oven. Burr gathered supplies and recruited followers, sure, but his little expedition never actually attacked anything or anyone belonging to the United States. The closest thing to an overt act was floating down the Mississippi River with a few dozen men, which is hardly the massive military operation Jefferson's administration described in their indictment. The constitutional requirement for 2 witnesses to the same overt act proves to be Burr's salvation, because apparently nobody thought to bring a buddy when witnessing potential treason. You've got plenty of people who saw Burr talking about his plans, and others who witnessed him gathering supplies, but finding 2 people who witnessed the exact same treasonous act is like trying to find 2 people who saw the same shooting star at the same moment. What most legal scholars don't mention is that this 2-witness rule was borrowed directly from English law, where it had already proven nearly impossible to satisfy in political cases. Marshall's interpretation of levying war becomes the key that unlocks Burr's cell door. The Chief Justice insists that levying war requires actual military action against the government, not just talking about it really enthusiastically at dinner parties. By this standard, half of Congress would be guilty of treason every time they complain about the other party, which is probably closer to the truth than anyone wants to admit. The prosecution argues that conspiracy should count as treason, but Marshall shoots that down faster than a clay pigeon, explaining that the Constitution says what it means and means what it says. You witness the exact moment when everyone in the courtroom realizes Burr is going to walk free, and it's like watching air slowly leak out of a giant balloon. The prosecution has spent months building their case around the assumption that planning treason equals committing treason, only to discover that constitutional law doesn't work that way. It's the legal equivalent of showing up to a football game prepared to play basketball. You might have all the right moves, but you're playing by the wrong rules entirely. The irony of this situation would make Shakespeare weep with artistic joy. Jefferson, the champion of strict constitutional interpretation when it served his political purposes, now finds himself on the wrong end of constitutional literalism. Marshall is essentially using Jefferson's own political philosophy against him, insisting that the Constitution means exactly what it says, rather than what politicians wish it said. You're watching the ultimate cosmic justice play out in real time, as Jefferson gets hoisted by his own constitutional petard. What makes this technicality even more frustrating for Burr's enemies is how obviously guilty he looks, despite being legally innocent. The man clearly planned something sketchy involving Western territories and foreign powers, but planning isn't doing, and the law cares more about actions than intentions. It's like watching someone you know is guilty escape conviction because the police forgot to read them their rights. Technically correct, but emotionally unsatisfying for anyone invested in seeing justice served. The precedent Marshall establishes, with his strict interpretation of treason, will protect Americans for generations, even though it probably wasn't designed to protect people like Aaron Burr. By insisting on concrete evidence of actual treasonous acts, the Chief Justice makes it nearly impossible for future administrations to weaponize treason charges against political opponents. Historians still argue about whether this was Marshall's intention or just a happy accident of constitutional interpretation, but the result is the same. American democracy gets stronger protections against authoritarian overreach. You observe how the prosecution tries desperately to reframe their evidence to meet Marshall's standards, like students frantically rewriting essays after learning they've been answering the wrong question all semester. They present testimony about Burr's grand plans and suspicious activities, but Marshall keeps asking the same question. Where's the overt act of levying war? It's like playing 20 questions with someone who already knows the answer and enjoys watching you struggle to find it. The defense barely has to make an argument because Marshall's constitutional interpretation does most of their work for them. Burr's lawyers essentially sit back and watch the prosecution tie themselves in knots, trying to prove something that can't be proven under the legal standards the Chief Justice demands. It's the ultimate example of letting your opponent defeat themselves, like watching someone argue their way out of a winning position through sheer stubborn adherence to a losing strategy. As the trial reaches its inevitable conclusion, you realize you've witnessed something historically significant. Beyond just Burr's acquittal, Marshall has essentially created a firewall around the definition of treason that will make it incredibly difficult for future prosecutors to abuse this charge for political purposes. The technicality that saved Burr becomes the constitutional protection that will save countless other Americans from politically motivated prosecutions in the centuries to come. The final irony is that Burr probably was guilty of something treasonous in spirit, if not in law. His Western schemes clearly involved some combination of filibustering, territorial conquest, and empire building that violated both American sovereignty and international law. But the beauty of constitutional government is that it protects even unsympathetic defendants when prosecutors can't meet their burden of proof. You've just watched the Constitution work exactly as designed, protecting individual rights even when those individuals probably don't deserve protection. Marshall's pedantic insistence on legal technicalities turns out to be the very thing that makes American justice more just, even when justice feels frustratingly incomplete. You follow Burr's years of poverty and scheming across Europe, still dreaming of grand conspiracies. And honestly, watching this man's descent from American vice president to broke European vagabond is like binge-watching a really depressing season of a reality show. Picture someone who once dined with presidents now haggling over bread prices in Parisian markets, his once pristine wardrobe slowly deteriorating into the kind of shabby genteel look that screams fallen aristocrat with delusions of grandeur. The man who nearly became emperor of the American West is now begging European monarchs for pocket change and military backing, which is roughly equivalent to your unemployed uncle pitching get-rich-quick schemes at family reunions. Burr arrives in Europe in 1808 with the desperate energy of someone who's burned every bridge in America, but still believes he's destined for greatness. He immediately sets about trying to convince every European power that they should fund his return to American glory, like a political entrepreneur with the world's worst business plan. You watch him shuffle between London, Paris, Stockholm, and various German courts, carrying letters of introduction that grow increasingly worthless as word spreads about his American reputation. What most people don't know is that Burr actually kept detailed journals during this period, documenting his schemes with the meticulous care of someone who genuinely believed history would vindicate his efforts. The poverty hits him harder than a student loan payment after graduation. This is a man who once lived in Manhattan mansions and owned vast estates, now counting coins to afford basic meals and decent lodging. You can see the psychological toll as Burr tries to maintain the appearance of a gentleman, while his creditors circle like vultures at a roadside diner. He pawns jewelry, borrows money from anyone gullible enough to lend it, and writes increasingly desperate letters to American contacts who've long since stopped returning his correspondence. Historians still debate whether Burr's European exile was voluntary, or whether staying in America would have meant financial or physical ruin. His first stop in London reveals just how thoroughly his American reputation has preceded him. British officials treat him with the kind of polite suspicion usually reserved for door-to-door salesmen, or people claiming to be Nigerian princes with inheritance opportunities. Burr pitches schemes involving British support for American territorial expansion, apparently forgetting that Britain and America just finished fighting a war over exactly these kinds of issues. The Foreign Office listens to his proposals with the same enthusiasm most people show for unsolicited phone calls during dinner, which is to say none whatsoever. What makes Burr's European adventures particularly tragicomic is his complete inability to read the political room. He arrives in France during Napoleon's height of power, expecting to be received as a fellow revolutionary, only to discover that the French have their hands full conquering the rest of Europe without adding American schemes to their to-do list. You watch him present elaborate plans for French-supported invasions of Mexico and Canada, apparently unaware that Napoleon has slightly more pressing concerns, like that whole Russian campaign thing that's about to go spectacularly wrong. The Swedish episode reads like something out of a political farce. Burr somehow convinces himself that Sweden, of all places, might be interested in supporting his American ambitions, which makes about as much sense as asking your local coffee shop to fund your space program. He spends months in Stockholm, living in increasingly shabby circumstances, while trying to gain audience with King Gustav IV Adolf, who apparently has better things to do than listen to exiled American politicians pitch continent-spanning conspiracy theories. You observe how Burr's letters home become increasingly delusional as his circumstances deteriorate. He writes to his daughter Theodosia with the forced optimism of someone trying to convince themselves that everything is going according to plan, even as creditors chase him from city to city like a very slow-moving action movie. His correspondence reveals a man who genuinely cannot accept that his grand dreams have collapsed into petty survival, still believing that the right European patron will restore him to American prominence. The truly pathetic part of Burr's European sojourn is how he clings to the trappings of his former status while living in actual poverty. He insists on maintaining appearances at social functions he can barely afford to attend, wearing increasingly threadbare clothes with the dignity of someone who refuses to admit their circumstances have changed. It's like watching someone continue to order expensive wine while secretly checking their bank balance, except Burr's been doing it for years across multiple countries. What most historians gloss over is the sheer mundane misery of Burr's daily existence during this period. You're talking about a man who once commanded respect and attention, now spending hours writing letters that go unanswered and proposals that get filed in the European equivalent of junk mail folders. His days consist of waiting in antechambers, making awkward small talk with minor officials, and trying to stretch meager funds across basic living expenses. It's the kind of grinding, humiliating poverty that would break most people's spirits. But Burr keeps scheming with the persistence of someone who's never learned to quit. The French period becomes particularly desperate as Burr realizes that Napoleon's government views him as more liability than asset. French officials treat him with polite indifference, occasionally throwing him small amounts of money the way you might tip a street performer, not because you're impressed, but because you feel slightly sorry for them. Burr interprets these minimal gestures as signs of serious interest, like someone reading romantic intent into basic customer service interactions. His attempts to return to America get blocked repeatedly, creating a Kafka-esque situation where he's too notorious to go home, but too broke to stay abroad comfortably. American officials refuse to issue proper travel documents, while European governments grow tired of his presence and schemes. You watch him become essentially stateless, carrying letters and documents that don't quite give him legal standing anywhere, like someone stuck in the world's most depressing version of diplomatic limbo. The low point comes when Burr starts borrowing money from other American exiles and expatriates, essentially becoming a cautionary tale within the small community of Americans abroad. These are people who knew him during his glory days, and watching him catch loans and favors must have been like seeing a former celebrity reduced to asking for spare change. What's particularly sad is how Burr continues to present these interactions as temporary setbacks rather than admitting his circumstances have fundamentally changed. You notice how his schemes become increasingly fantastic as his real-world options diminish. Unable to gain serious backing for American adventures, Burr starts proposing European territorial ventures that make even less sense than his original Western Empire plans. He suggests Swedish expeditions to Norway, British investments in South, American mining, and French colonial ventures that exist only in his imagination. It's like watching someone's dreams gradually detach from any connection to reality, powered by desperation and an inability to accept failure. The correspondence with his daughter Theodosia during this period reveals the human cost of Burr's European exile. She's dealing with her own family troubles in America while trying to send money to her increasingly desperate father, creating a situation where the parent-child financial relationship has completely reversed. Burr's letters mix grandiose promises of future success with barely concealed pleas for financial support, like someone trying to maintain dignity while asking to borrow rent money. When news of the War of 1812 reaches Europe, Burr sees it as his opportunity for dramatic return and rehabilitation. He immediately begins crafting schemes to offer his services to the American war effort, apparently forgetting that he's still considered a traitor by half the country and a dangerous nuisance. By the other half, you watch him write increasingly frantic letters to American officials, offering military expertise and political connections that no longer exist, like someone trying to cash a check from a closed bank account. The final phase of his European exile becomes a race between his dwindling resources and his ability to secure passage home. Burr literally cannot afford to stay in Europe much longer, but he also can't afford proper transportation back to America, creating the kind of catch-22 situation that would be funny if it weren't so desperate. Historians still argue about exactly how he finally managed to book passage home, but the most likely explanation involves a combination of borrowed money, sold possessions, and sheer stubborn determination to escape his European purgatory. You witness Burr's quiet comeback to New York, where he practices law while his imperial dreams fade into memory. And honestly, it's like watching a former child star trying to rebuild their career by doing dinner theater in their hometown. The Manx, man who once commanded national attention, now slips back into Manhattan society with all the fanfare of someone returning from an embarrassing family vacation that went on way too long. Picture the most notorious political figure of his generation suddenly becoming just another middle-aged lawyer, grinding out divorce cases and property disputes, which is roughly equivalent to a former rock star playing acoustic sets at coffee shops for tip money. Burr's return in 1812 happens with such deliberate quietness that most New Yorkers don't even notice at first. He's learned the hard way that dramatic entrances tend to backfire spectacularly, so instead of announcing his comeback, he simply starts showing up at his old haunts like nothing happened. You watch him walk into taverns and law offices with the casual confidence of someone pretending the last 4 years of European exile were just an extended business trip rather than a desperate flight from American justice and creditors. The legal community's reaction to his return is fascinatingly mixed, like colleagues welcoming back someone who left under mysterious circumstances, and nobody wants to ask too many questions about where they've been. Some lawyers remember Burr's brilliant legal mind and are genuinely happy to see him back, while others treat him with the cautious politeness usually reserved for reformed alcoholics at office parties. What most people don't realize is that Burr's European exile actually enhanced his legal knowledge in some ways, as he'd spent years studying different legal systems while trying to navigate international diplomatic complexities. You observe how Burr deliberately chooses the most mundane cases possible, like someone trying to rebuild their reputation by being aggressively normal. Instead of the high-profile political cases that once defined his career, he takes on property disputes, commercial litigation, and domestic relations matters. The legal equivalent of eating plain oatmeal after years of exotic cuisine. His former imperial ambitions have been replaced by the modest goal of paying rent and rebuilding some semblance of respectability, which is probably the most dramatic character arc in American political history. The office he rents is a far cry from his former Manhattan mansion, located in a decidedly unfashionable part of town with the kind of modest furnishings that scream fallen from grace but trying to maintain dignity. You can see him carefully budgeting for basic supplies and taking cases he would have dismissed as beneath his notice during his glory days. The man who once entertained foreign diplomats now haggles with clients over legal fees like someone trying to stretch grocery money until payday. What makes Burr's legal comeback particularly interesting is how his notorious reputation actually helps him with certain types of clients. People facing their own scandals and social ostracism seek him out precisely because he understands what it feels like to be a pariah. You watch him develop a specialty in representing society's outcasts and controversial figures, like someone who's found their niche by embracing rather than fighting their damaged reputation. Historians still debate whether this was calculated career strategy or just making the best of a bad situation. His relationship with former colleagues reveals the complex social dynamics of his return. Some old friends genuinely welcome him back, while others maintain polite distance to protect their own reputations. You can see the careful dance of social rehabilitation playing out in drawing rooms and legal offices as Burr gradually works his way back into circles that once considered him completely beyond redemption. It's like watching someone rebuild their credit score one small payment at a time, except with social standing instead of financial credibility. The most poignant aspect of Burr's return is how thoroughly his imperial dreams have been replaced by domestic concerns. The man who once schemed to conquer Mexico now worries about client payments and office rent, like someone whose grandiose startup plans have been replaced by the reality of making mortgage payments. You watch him handle routine legal paperwork with the same attention to detail he once devoted to planning continental empires, which is either admirably adaptive or tragically diminished, depending on your perspective. His correspondence during this period shows a man genuinely trying to become ordinary after a lifetime of extraordinary ambition. Burr writes to friends and family with none of the grandiose scheming that characterized his European letters, instead discussing mundane matters of legal practice and daily life. What most biographers miss is how this represents a fundamental psychological shift. Burr has finally learned to find satisfaction in small successes rather than constantly reaching for impossible goals. You notice how carefully Burr avoids political topics in public, like someone who's learned their lesson about controversial opinions the hard way. He declines invitations to political gatherings and steers conversations away from national affairs with the skill of someone who's discovered that discretion really is the better part of valor. The man who once thrived on political controversy now treats it like a recovering gambling addict, treats casinos, something to be avoided at all costs. The legal cases he takes on reveal a man who's genuinely good at his profession when he's not distracted by dreams of empire. Burr wins cases through careful preparation and clever arguments rather than political connections or dramatic courtroom theater. You watch him develop a reputation for competent, reliable legal work, which might sound boring, but represents a complete reinvention for someone whose previous career was built on scandal and spectacle. His financial situation slowly improves as his legal practice grows, though he never again achieves the wealth and status of his earlier years. It's like watching someone rebuild their life from scratch in middle age, accepting that they'll never recapture their peak, but finding dignity in honest work and modest success. Burr pays off old debts, maintains a simple lifestyle, and seems genuinely content with his reduced circumstances, which represents either remarkable personal growth or exhausted resignation. The tragic undertone to Burr's comeback is his relationship with his daughter Theodosia, whose own life has been marked by the social consequences of his notoriety. You can see how his exile and disgrace have affected his family relationships, creating a distance that can't be completely bridged by his return to respectability. Their correspondence reveals mutual affection, shadowed by the recognition that his choices have cost them both dearly, in ways that can't be easily repaired. What's fascinating is how New York society gradually reabsorbs Burr, like a social organism slowly accepting back a previously rejected cell. By maintaining consistently boring behavior and avoiding any hint of controversy, he manages to become just another aging lawyer rather than the notorious Aaron Burr. It's a masterclass in reputation rehabilitation through strategic mediocrity, proving that sometimes the best way to overcome a scandalous past is to become aggressively unremarkable. His former political enemies seem genuinely surprised by his transformation, having expected him to return with new schemes and controversies. Instead, they find a man who appears genuinely content with legal practice and domestic tranquility, like someone who's finally learned to appreciate what they have rather than constantly reaching for what they can't achieve. The Hamilton Federalists, who once considered him their greatest threat, now struggle to maintain their animosity towards someone who's become so thoroughly ordinary. You witness the gradual fading of Burr's imperial dreams as day-to-day legal work replaces grandiose scheming in his mental landscape. The man who once envisioned himself as emperor of the American West now finds satisfaction in winning property disputes and contract cases. It's either the most successful personal reinvention in American history or the saddest example of dreams defeated by reality. And honestly, it's probably both at the same time. The ultimate irony of Burr's return is that by successfully becoming boring, he achieves a kind of success that eluded him during his years of dramatic scheming. His legal practice provides steady income, his reputation slowly recovers, and he manages to live out his remaining years in relative peace and obscurity. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply learning when to stop fighting battles you can't win and finding contentment in the life that's actually available, rather than the one you always imagined you deserved. You contemplate how close America came to fracturing and what Burr's failed kingdom might have meant for history. And honestly, it's one of those sliding doors moments that makes you wonder how different our world might look if one ambitious man's dreams had actually succeeded. Picture an alternate timeline where the American West becomes its own empire, where the Louisiana Purchase gets carved up between competing nations, and where the United States never grows beyond the original. 13 colonies. The ripple effects would have reshaped everything from the Civil War to World War II, like dropping a stone into a perfectly calm pond and watching the waves spread outward through centuries of consequence. Burr's vision of a Western empire wasn't just personal ambition. It represented a fundamentally different path for North American development. You can imagine a continent divided between multiple competing powers. The United States clinging to the Atlantic coast, a Burr empire controlling the Mississippi Valley, British Canada expanding southward, and Spanish Mexico holding firm in the Southwest. Instead of manifest destiny, you'd have had something closer to the European model of competing nation-states, with all the warfare and diplomatic complexity that implies. The economic implications alone would have been staggering. Without control of the Mississippi River and the vast agricultural potential of the Louisiana Territory, the United States might never have developed into the agricultural powerhouse that funded its industrial revolution. You're talking about a completely different trajectory for American economic development, one where regional powers compete for resources rather than a single nation exploiting an entire continent's wealth. What most historians don't fully appreciate is how Burr's Western Empire might have actually prevented the conditions that led to the Civil War by creating multiple smaller nations instead of one large one, struggling with sectional differences. The constitutional crisis Burr's success would have created makes modern political divisions look like friendly disagreements. Picture the legal and diplomatic nightmare of a sitting vice president successfully seceding with American territory. It would have shattered every assumption about federal authority and state loyalty that the founders built into the Constitution. The precedent alone would have encouraged every disgruntled region to consider independence whenever they disagreed with federal policy, potentially turning the United States into something resembling the Holy Roman Empire's collection of semi-independent principalities. You can almost see the domino effect spreading across the continent as Burr's success inspired other separatist movements. New England Federalists might have felt emboldened to pursue their own independence during the War of 1812, while Western territories could have declared themselves sovereign rather than seeking statehood, instead of one expanding nation, North. America might have resembled South America's collection of post-colonial republics, each pursuing its own destiny, while occasionally fighting border wars with its neighbors. The international implications would have been equally dramatic, as European powers rushed to exploit American weakness and fragmentation. Britain and Spain would have had opportunities to reclaim lost territories or establish new spheres of influence, while France might have maintained its foothold in North America through alliance with Burr's empire. The balance of power that allowed the United States to develop in relative security would have collapsed, forcing each American successor state to navigate complex European diplomatic relationships. What makes Burr's failure even more significant is how narrow his margin of defeat actually was. A few different decisions by key figures. If Jefferson had been less determined, if Marshall had been less constitutionally rigid, if Wilkinson had been more competent, and American history takes a completely different turn. You're looking at one of those historical pivot points where individual personalities and specific circumstances combine to preserve national unity by the thinnest of margins. The social and cultural consequences of Burr's success would have rippled through American development in ways we can barely imagine. Without the vast Western territories to absorb population growth and social tensions, the original states might have developed along different lines entirely. The frontier experience that shaped American character and institutions would have been limited to whatever territories each successor nation could claim, fundamentally altering the democratic and individualistic culture that emerged from westward. Expansion. Perhaps most intriguingly, Burr's Western Empire might have handled the slavery question differently than the United States ultimately did. With a smaller territory and different economic base, his nation might have evolved toward gradual emancipation or attracted European immigrants who opposed slavery, creating an interesting alternative to both the plantation South and industrial North. Of course, it's equally possible that Burr's empire would have become even more dependent on slave labor, making the moral contradictions of American democracy even more stark and geographically concentrated. The technological and scientific development of North America would have followed completely different patterns with multiple competing nations, rather than one expanding power. Instead of a transcontinental railroad connecting Atlantic and Pacific, you might have had competing rail networks, stopping at national borders, slowing development and increasing transportation costs. The kind of large-scale infrastructure projects that defined American growth would have been much more difficult to coordinate across multiple sovereign nations with potentially conflicting interests. You can imagine how different the American Civil War would have looked, or whether it would have happened at all, if Burr's empire had succeeded in fragmenting the continent earlier. Instead of one nation struggling with sectional differences over slavery, you might have had multiple smaller conflicts between neighboring nations with different labor systems and economic interests. The moral clarity of the Union cause might have been muddied by competing national loyalties and territorial disputes that had nothing to do with slavery. As you consider all these alternative histories, the weight of what actually happened becomes more apparent. Burr's failure preserved something precious and fragile, the possibility of continental unity under democratic institutions that could eventually expand to include all Americans, regardless of race or origin. His imperial dreams, if realized, might have created a more typically human pattern of competing nations and endless border conflicts, rather than the unique experiment in continental democracy that America became. The legal precedents established during Burr's trial continue to protect Americans from politically motivated prosecutions, while the constitutional principles Marshall defended have become cornerstones of judicial independence. Even in failure, Burr's conspiracy strengthened American institutions by forcing them to define their limits and prove their resilience under pressure. And now, as the courtroom fades and the historical echoes grow quieter, you can rest knowing that sometimes the most important victories are the disasters that never happened, the empires that never rose, the fractures that never spread. America held together through storms that could have torn it apart, guided by principles stronger than any single person's ambitions. The whispers of what might have been grow softer now, like distant thunder moving away across the plains. Burr's dreams dissolving into the gentle mist of memory, while the nation he couldn't break continued growing, imperfect but intact, toward a future none of them could imagine. Sleep now knowing that even failed conspiracies can serve democracy, that even defeated ambitions can strengthen the foundations of freedom, that sometimes the greatest service to history is simply not succeeding, you.